Hello, everybody. My name is Kathryn Van Overen. I'm a school counselor at East Kentwood High School, and I'm also a member of the Refugee Education Center Board of Directors, and I'm happy to share some information about our refugee students with fellow educators and about mental health services that might be available in your community or in your school. So, one of the things that I want to make sure that all of our staff are really thoughtful of are their own anxieties and concerns and their own responses to COVID and the quarantine and the pandemic, and how are they feeling about returning to school, because we have to make sure that we are in a good mindset in order to make sure that we don't negatively impact our students' return to school as well, especially for students who already have some trauma in their past, especially for students who might be a little bit nervous about returning to education, or who might be really excited. And we want to make sure to have them understand that this is going to be great, but it's going to be different. And we want to support them in any way that they can. I know that there is a lot of anxiety among school staff these days to make sure that what is happening in their schools is excellent education, but is also supportive and safe and good for everybody. So I want to make a note to start that we really want staff to identify their own concerns and make sure to address them and to keep themselves healthy, because that's the best way to serve students. And be patient. Things are not going to go perfectly for you, for your refugee students, for your other students, and we all have to realize that we might have to make different decisions along the way that might change things. What we do know about refugees and mental health is that refugees already have an increased level of trauma. Refugees have an increased level of PTSD and other kind of trauma-related mental health concerns. And some have been well addressed. Some are getting really great services for those incidents in their past. Others have no services and have not addressed any of those traumas. Some are coping incredibly well with whatever has happened in their life, and some are coping incredibly badly. And so we have to know that even going into the pandemic, our refugee students were already living with some of their own trauma just by virtue of their history that created the situation where they have to be refugees. I also want to mention that a lot of our schools are already working on trauma-informed education and trauma-informed practices, and this is the most important time to continue to work on those practices and to be conscious of the trauma that our students might have encountered, and to make sure that we're thinking about those trauma-informed practices and understanding that student behavior and misbehavior might not be related to exactly what you're saying in that moment, but might be related to something that happened in the past, and to be very patient with ourselves, with each other, and very specific about what we do expect from students, and not assume that they know things that they don't know. Specifically with the pandemic, specifically with COVID, be conscious that many of our refugee families are probably more impacted by the economic concerns and the healthcare concerns of COVID just by virtue of their situation. I know in Kentwood, many of our refugee families have workplace conditions that might not be perfect, and they have been working throughout the pandemic in essential jobs. Some of them in factory conditions, some of them in local stores, some of them in all sorts of different settings where they are exposed to illness. And some of our families have been impacted, certainly, by COVID specifically. There are living conditions that certainly exacerbate the issues of COVID. Many of our refugee families live with multiple families in a smaller kind of living environment. It's very difficult to social distance. Many of the cultures that the refugee families come from are very communal cultures, and so it's difficult to to change that and to make sure that families are staying away from each other when that is their support system in the United States, in our country. And we want to make sure that we don't dishonor a cultural tradition by trying to keep people safe, but we do keep people safe at the same time. And we do have refugee families who have very difficult time accessing healthcare, and that's where our community agencies come in and can really be helpful. And healthcare, both physical healthcare and mental healthcare, are super important. What are your school resources? Especially if you're a teacher, you have a lot to consider right now, and you may say, wow, this is just too much for me. I really don't know how to address student mental health concerns as well as all of the other things that I'm thinking about. So we want to really have you be concentrating on the resources that are in your school. We hope that the majority of schools have a school counselor, a dedicated school counselor. We understand most high schools do, middle schools we hope do, and elementaries it might be a little more hit or miss. But we really want you to utilize those school counselor services. School counselors are licensed to know some of the community resources. They're licensed and trained to help students both academically, with career and college planning, and with social and emotional concerns. So your school counselor would be a great place to start. And certainly one of the things that I do as a school counselor and all my colleagues do is if we don't know the answer, we look for it. And so I encourage you to start there. We also have many of our schools that might be looking at this video who have school community partnerships, such as KSSN. KSSN is Kent School Services Network. Other schools might have a different partnership with some local agencies. In our area, KSSN looks different in every school, but it usually consists of a school social worker or a therapist who might be available to students and families, or a community school coordinator who might be able to access whatever community resources are available. The other resource that's available in a lot of schools is a school social worker. I will say in some school districts, the school social worker does not have access to general education students, but they do have access to special education students and to getting them the help in the community resources and the coping skills that are really necessary to get through school. We have other community resources. So first of all, I would encourage you to look at, have your school counselor or your KSSN worker or your other school, community school partnership folks help. Absent that, there are some community resources that are directly available to you. The Refugee Education Center actually has some of those resources on speed dial, let's say. And one of the things that the REC can help with is to coordinate some of those healthcare services, which include mental health services. So if you find a student who is maybe not coping well with the pandemic, or you're finding has a really unusual reaction, maybe something different, especially if you know the student before, or you're finding somebody's talking about not sleeping or not eating correctly, or really just not being able to concentrate on schoolwork, or you're finding somebody when you're doing remote learning is not getting out of bed on a regular basis, I would certainly start to seek some services. And the Refugee Education Center might be a place that could help lead that direction. I understand that there are people from both Kent and Ottawa County who might be watching this. Network 180 is the Kent County clearinghouse for mental health services, and so our families can access Network 180. It is not a specific service, it is a place for an evaluation where then they can determine what the best service is from there. And a call to Network 180 is never a bad idea to see if a student or a family can get some resources that they might need in Kent County. Community mental health might have a similar service in Ottawa County. I have a link to their website. And that could be very helpful. If a refugee family happens to have a family physician, sometimes that is the best way to convince a family that mental health services are necessary. We have a lot of different cultures that are represented in West Michigan, and we can't assume that all of them really even understand what mental health is or are willing to pursue those services. So sometimes they will listen to a doctor, a medical doctor, and if a medical doctor says that a student or a family member might need help, they might be more willing to pursue some kind of service. And we have to be really careful to think about how we talk about mental health services and make sure that the student and the family understands that nothing's wrong. It's just that somebody might need some assistance to be better. Bethany Christian Services also has some trauma support services that could be really good. And then this State of Michigan website has a lot of different links that could be helpful in accessing mental health services for your students and your families, quite frankly. There are also some national and international resources, just some things that you might want to look at. Some of them even like the SAMHSA Refugee Behavior Resources really has some good information about things that are trends and about behavioral health, that some resources that might be available for teachers. You can often even find some potential information about the cultures that the students might come from, or some of the symptoms that you might look for, or some things that teachers can really do to help all students to feel better about their own situation and maybe explore some things that will help. The World Health Organization also has some mental health resources, and the Mental Health Institute in Michigan is helpful. I know as educators, one of the things that we're trying to plan for is school reentry, and the American School Counselor Association put together a very comprehensive school reentry plan that includes a lot of information about social emotional learning. And we want to very much encourage all schools to not just be returning to school to teach students information about subject matter, but also to teach social emotional skills that can help them. Because really, if we don't master some of those social emotional skills, the other learning is just not going to happen. So what I would say for our refugee students more than anything is to just be really patient with yourself and with them. There are a lot of changes coming their way. There's a lot to adapt to, and sometimes that's overwhelming. And so if you have to maybe repeat the same information multiple times, maybe put it in some simpler blocks to decrease some of the anxiety, to really use those SIOP methods of making sure that we're not doing too much at any given time, I think is really important and can help your refugee students along the way. I hope that that has been a helpful bunch of information, and you're welcome to reach out to me at kentwoodps.org. It's Kathryn.Van@kentwoodps.org. I'm certainly not the expert in this area, but it is something that I care a lot about, both the refugee students and making sure that we have a great start to whatever the school year might look like.